Yes, well, Harvard University have announced they will not require SAT or ACT scores for admission over the next 4 years. But critics have argued that these scores are racially and culturally biased, do not reflect the true ability of many students, but instead their ability to pay for tutoring. The university has decided to drop the score requirements so that those whose education was affected by the pandemic will not miss out on a place.
Yes, well, Inaya Folarin Iman, our social and cultural editor, is here to talk us through this. Thanks for joining us. Many people won't be familiar with this, obviously, because it's American. We don't really have SAT. We have SATs, I suppose, in primary school here. But just explain to us why Harvard have done this and why the critics of SATs are saying they're actually racially biased tests.
Yeah, so SATs are effectively, a scoring of examinations equivalent to what we have, international baccalaureate, A-levels. It's a way in which universities and institutions can determine what educational level and scores that the students have. And they originally paused the form of examination during the pandemic because many people were not able to get access to some of the testing centres, but now it seems that they are continuing it for another 4 years. And this is being welcomed by some groups who have said that it has been culturally and racially insensitive in the examination. But it's quite a curious thing to make that suggestion. I mean, all forms of examination and testing has its challenges, but they argue that, for example, wealthy people are able to train their young people or their students in order to actually get good grades. But we know that, for example, alternative things have their challenges also. So if you are looking at people's extracurricular activities, we know that wealthy students have much better access to, extracurricular activities, sports and things that help them to basically gain those things that other poorer students have. If it's coursework, oftentimes the parents can help. So there's one thing when it comes to examination, that regardless of your background, regardless of your, skills and networking and wealth, it's a level playing field. And so this idea that it is racially and culturally insensitive is a very bizarre accusation.
Yes, and it implies, I suppose, that sort of ethnic minority students need to have the bar lowered for them almost, doesn't it? And I'm aware that Harvard has actually been sued by a group of Asian American applicants for discrimination, basically, because they say you're holding us to a higher standard than other students. You're expecting us to have higher scores than everybody else. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, I mean, this has been an ongoing controversy in America where Asian American students have argued that they are being discriminated against when it comes to Ivy League universities, in particular the elite level universities, because they tend to, on average, score higher. So on the one hand, they'll have the scoring, but when it comes to the subjective elements, such as the interview, then they will often be judged lower for personal characteristics. And it is argued by some of these Asian Americans that they are trying to reduce the number of Asian Americans going to these Ivy Leagues, or they will be massively overrepresented. But it tells you the kind of contradictions of a lot of the identity narrative that often ethnic minority groups such as Jewish Americans or Asian Americans that do higher, they are not considered the ones that are being culturally victimised and often are classed as closer to being white or having privileges than the black or Latino Americans. Yeah. And it always exposes the contradictions when you categorise people in such a narrow way.
How do you actually see this being resolved then, if at all?
Well, I think testing, in my personal view, I think testing is one of the best ways for students, regardless of your economic, social circumstances. That is something that if you are successful when it comes to the examination, then that is a good indicator of your ability to do well. But it does seem that, particularly in America, but in many institutions, even here in the UK, we are seeing this move towards lowering standards. There was a recent development in many universities where, when it comes to essays, there will no longer be marking people based off of their grammar. And it does seem that this ability to hold people to higher expectations across educational institutions is being replaced by almost protecting them from being challenged, preventing them from actually having, being challenged. And I think that's very unfortunate for poorer students.
I think it's unfortunate as well for a lot of children, actually, and young adults, because when they do get, let's say they get, 4 A stars or whatever, their teachers are basically giving those 4 A stars A-level or whatever the metric is now, and they do get into a Harvard or they do get into an Oxbridge, And they get there, and then not always, but some of the time, they'll get a massive shock because they'll realise that their grades were inflated, and they'll really struggle to actually exist in that environment, and that's bad for their mental health.
That's a very, very important point. Actually, we do see that there is a higher dropout rate in Ivy League universities for many African-American students, and some people have argued that it is because, for example, the grade inflation that you're mentioning, but also if you come from a chaotic home, if you come from a chaotic background, schools are often the only place where you get discipline, structure and high expectations, and that could be really a lifesaver for many of these young people. So if we are now eroding those things, then you are now finding there is no space for those kids to get discipline and structure, which will stand them in really good stead as they grow older.
Well, thank you so much for talking us through that and making it a lot clearer. Inaya Folarin Iman, there, our social and cultural editor. I think it's quite unfortunate as well because when you lower the standard or lower the bar for certain groups of students, whether it's ethnic minority students, working class students, I think people do start assuming every ethnic minority or working class person is there because they've had the bar lowered for them and not there on their own merits. And this has happened to me, actually, when somebody assumed I'd gotten into the university I'd gotten into through some diversity scheme. And not through my own merit, and they were just innocently. It was just an innocent person, a friend of mine, who just assumed that, and that was just an assumption. That was an assumption that they'd made. They were like, "Oh, didn't you get in on one of those?"
Why would you say that?
I don't know. I mean, let's put it this way: I was not impressed by that assumption, but that's what happens when.
Have they been seen since?
Well, I mean, that's a story for another day.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that was, of course, Inaya. Thank you very much. Right, well.